Philip Foster, thank you very much for coming on again. It's an absolute pleasure to have you back. You very kindly came and spoke up in our event in Gateshead, and you were so well received. Now, you've had a reprint of a wonderful book you've written called While the Earth Endures. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and other things that are happening where we are at the moment.
Yeah, right. Well, the book itself I originally published way back in 2009, when that was when I got it out. And I've really been doing updates ever since, because there's a lot of what you might call time-sensitive graphs in the book about climate. And so obviously one tries to keep up to date. So graphs where possible are updated from 2009 as it was, but I've done several, but this is the latest run, which is updated to 2024, according to, yeah.
That's fantastic. So take us through a little bit of the book, will you?
Yeah. Yes. Right. Then you won't need to buy it, will you?
But no, that's not true.
I know. Well, I'm quite whatever. No, the point about my book was that I felt, certainly at the time in 2009, that because the church was tending to head for the environmental lobby about everything, including, of course, climate, I felt somebody need to say something fairly substantial, I trust, that put the other side. In order to do that, I also took the opportunity to deal with another area, which is sort of you might call domestic Christian theology, where some people, for understandable reasons, think that the Bible is saying the earth is perhaps only 6,000 years old. Now, that is not a view I hold, and I don't actually think it's a view the Bible holds, if I could put it that way. But there is quite a strong group of people who think that, and I don't want to sound disrespectful, but I don't agree. And I think it doesn't help to understand climate if you don't understand the ancient history of the planet, because it goes back 4 billion years, a little before I was born, I think. And there's been a huge amount of goings on planet Earth since kickoff about 4 billion years ago. So I spent quite a lot of the early part of the book dealing with that, and then dealing with, on the other side, the sort of what I call the Dawkins atheism. Again, I say respect for Dawkins. He's a perfectly decent chap in his own right. But he has what you might call 19th century atheistic views. I can only put it that way. It's very out of date, even for an atheist. And I felt that sort of thing needs to be tackled as well. So I spend quite a lot of time tackling the issue of how it is not only wildly improbable, it is next to impossible that life could start on this planet, or anywhere for that matter, simply by chance. There is a hand behind it. And it's surprising how many scientists are actually of that view. They won't necessarily vocalize it loudly, but they are aware that the moment you start looking at the laws of physics, particularly, and also the wild excitement of what's going on in the world in terms of biology, you cannot help but think somebody's behind this. It cannot just be a random process. So I spend quite a lot of time dealing with that, the nuts and bolts of it. I hope that it would be helpful to Christians to read that as well. So I put those two bits together. And then I moved into the big issue of climate change. And I simply go through what you might call the data behind what's supposed to be the theory about global warming. And I hope to demonstrate to satisfaction that the issue of so-called greenhouse gases is in itself fallacious. The carbon dioxide is not a dangerous gas. It is the basis of all life on this planet. Astonishingly, the BBC doesn't understand this. I was watching by accident, I have to say, something called Beech Grove, which was a kind of variation of Gardener's World. And this was last November, and there was this earnest young man explaining to us how photosynthesis works, how And he was saying, well, light from the sun comes down, and he held out a leaf and he said it strikes the leaf and the chlorophyll turns it into sugar and the tree grows. And I thought, excuse me, I think you've left something out. Namely carbon dioxide, without which nothing happens, and water vapor. He did it twice in a half-an-hour program. In both occasions, I can't say, I think it must have been deliberate. He must have left out the fact that carbon dioxide has this extraordinarily positive role in nature, because to say so would upset the whole horror, carbon dioxide, the devil's gas, along with chlorine, according to the Greens, mustn't be mentioned as something positive, which is most extraordinary. But anyway, I deal with the issue of the so-called greenhouse gas, which actually the concept was disproved in 1909. The guy who came up with it, Arrhenius, I touched on it, I think, briefly in the lecture I gave, who at the turn of the last century came up with this idea that the Earth is warmer because of the presence of CO2 and water vapor, but CO2 mostly. Of course, nobody could prove it because you can't take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, about which I'll come back to later, and see if it does make it any colder, because you just can't do it. However, a chap in 1909 tried a simple experiment with greenhouses and showed that actually the way a greenhouse was supposed to work is not how it works. And I have to confess, as in having taught physics, that I taught the old-fashioned theory wrongly to my students. It just goes to show, you just trot out what the textbook says to some degree, and the textbooks are wrong, quite simply. Because the greenhouse does not warm up because of the glass that absorbs infrared and re-radiates the heat back into the greenhouse. This is nonsense. It doesn't do that. Glass does absorb some infrared, true, and does warm as a result, but it cannot possibly be warming the ground because it will be cooler than the ground. And there's a very old physical law. You can't move heat from the cooler to the hotter. It, as Flanders and Swan had it, you can try it if you like, but you far better not. He went on to sing. But the whole point here is that the greenhouse gas, in fact, you can test this any hot summer's day. Park your car out in the sun, which we often have to do. When you come in, it's flipping hot, I agree. Touch the dashboard, and you will find you will take your hand away quite quickly because it's very, very hot. Then touch the windscreen. It'll be warm. It couldn't possibly be true that the glass of the windscreen is warming the dashboard. It's to do with the fact heat comes in, it's absorbed by the ground, in the case of the black surface of a car or of Earth, and by convection, that enclosed space warms up, and that's an end of it. There is no enclosed space on planet Earth, so there's no greenhouse effect anyway. So the whole thing dies a death. But this was further confirmed by the landing, I think it was Apollo 16 or 17, I forget which, that left a thermometer array on the surface of the moon, just to see what the temperature day and night for moon, how it behaved. And it's a fortnightly thing because the moon has a fortnight day and a fortnight night, I'm told, not been there. But anyway, they measure the temperature. It's a very dull graph because it's simply hotter in the day and cooler in the night. But when they calculated what it should be, according to this old-fashioned scientist Arrhenius, and looked at the data, they found that the data showed that the moon was 30 degrees warmer than it should be. So in other words, this 30-degree difference, which Arrhenius claimed was due to CO2 on the Earth, happened on the moon. There's no CO2 on the moon, there's no air on the moon. And the reason is not too uncomplicated. It's simply that he overlooked or couldn't calculate for the fact that the heat from the sun is absorbed by the ground and sinks into the ground, if you like. And then at night, it comes back to the surface and keeps the place a little bit warmer. Very simple, but an easy mistake. Can't blame him. We all make mistakes. But anyway, there's no such thing as greenhouse gas, basically. So what is causing shifts in climate? That is the thing.
I wish you taught me physics.
Well,
Would
I
you like?
remember, I better not, I shall not divert onto the time when I taught physics in Nigeria. And I do remember with the class, they were Nigerians, very bright, I have to say. And I was taught what I thought was a brilliant lesson. With great care. And I thought it was absolutely I was a little younger than I am now, so a little bit silly in my head. Anyway, at the end of the lesson, a hand went up. Sir, I said, yes. What have we been talking about? Anyway, that's by the by. But
No, you explain things so clearly, and it clears up a load of things in my mind. And when you look at CO2,
yeah,
and I look around here now, they actually pump CO2 into polytunnels.
they do indeed. Yes.
Grow.
And very necessary to do so. We have an interesting person in the church I'm at the moment, and he grows cucumbers. This is in East Riding of Yorkshire. And he does it on a sort of, it's industrial, if you like, because he produces cucumbers all the year round. And indeed uses such a process in order to encourage the growth of the cucumbers. And they're perfectly good cucumbers. And he and I are in total agreement about climate. Because he knows now well that CO2 is not a dangerous thing, but in fact a very positive thing, and we could use more of it. We are rather short of it at the moment on the planet. There's not a lot we can do about that, but we are short of it.
So where does the net zero come from?
Well, I suppose it originates, of course, from the 2008 Climate Change Act, which I think Arch Miliband was the push behind it, along with a lady from, I can't remember, it's Friends of the Earth, I think, who drafted the actual act. She was a great expert on climate and things like that because she had a degree in English.
Ah, now I understand.
Yes, and she invented this, a whole host of things that we must do to save the planet. And the idea of reducing our carbon, they do use this word carbon emissions. It's nonsense, of course, but it sounds evil, doesn't it? Carbon, soot, black, dirt. Whereas, of course, it's carbon dioxide, which is a colorless, odorless gas, which, of course, is the source of all life. So that was part of it. And, of course, it became more and more as they worked in this sort of propaganda that we're killing ourselves, the planet's going to boil. That was the latest thing, wasn't it? They said planetary boiling. I love it. Could do with a bit of that. But, they think of more and more extreme fears to be generated about this. Whereas, so, I mean, the idea, therefore, we must target, and of course, they love targets, don't they? Target this, target that. We want to treat at least 10 cancer patients by 2030, this sort of thing in the national health. And now, the same with climate. We've got to, and all we're doing, unfortunately, is exporting our heavy industry to Asia and other places who have quite rightly not bothered about so-called carbon dioxide emissions. In fact, thankfully, they are not bothered because it's good for the planet, not bad. The other thing that they're now desperate about, and they've just spent 20 billion on it, which is carbon capture, which, it's a monstrous waste of money. In theory, yes, you can suck CO2 out of the air or out of your chimneys and so-called sequester it. They pump it into empty gas wells or whatever it is. I think there's a couple of problems with this. The first problem is that at some point it's going to come out again. An enormous bubble will come out. Sorry, this is a trivial thing, but it puts me in mind of my father used to tell me about his younger brother when they were both boys. Well, they still are. Well, they're both dead now. But and his younger brother hated spinach. And nurse, whoever it was, would be feeding his younger brother spinach. And it seemed to be going in. You see what I mean? And my father knew. He said, I knew what was going to happen. At which point, exactly. At which point there was an enormous explosion and all the spinach came out because he wasn't going to swallow it. It's a bit like that, I think, with carbon capture. I think it's the same thing. But the other thing, that if you actually extract carbon dioxide from the air, and here's something that you can't pass an act of parliament about, if you take it out of the air, it will be replaced from the oceans. As a matter of physics, there's nothing you can do to stop that. It's got an old-fashioned name, Henry's law. It may have other names as well, but basically it tells you that if you take gas away from above a liquid that has that gas in it, it will replace it. And vice versa, if you pump stuff in, it'll go back into the oceans. So in fact, there's already a natural equilibrium system. There's plenty of other factors involved, but there is this equilibrium, which anyway decides what the CO2 levels are going to be at the moment. And any attempt to remove it is like emptying the oceans with a teaspoon by standing on the shore. Waste of time.
Have you tried to have a conversation with Mr. said Miliband?
No, I confess I have not. And I'm trying to, I've only really talked to, having retired and moved up north, it's not been that easy. I can't see it's likely that he's the kind of person who will change his mind on this, because to say he hasn't got a mind to change is perhaps not quite fair, but he doesn't know any science. So therefore you can present him with all the science you like, and I'm sure people have. He doesn't understand it. So he'll shrug his shoulders and say, well, we're going to do it anyway, and ruin the country.
I think if you look around across the cabinet at the moment, and probably cabinet of the previous government and several before that, the lack of knowledge of the subjects that they're supposed to be in charge of. I'm thinking of somebody in the Treasury at the moment as the Chancellor. I'm thinking of somebody as Foreign Secretary who doesn't appear to be know where half the countries in the world are. I just despair. I
know it is very despairing. And I remember when the Climate Change Act in 2008 was voted through, with I think only 6 people voted against it out of 600. Conservative and Labour fell for it. I bet you Generic voted for it if he was around in 2008. I think he was. It's the 6 who voted against. One was Labour, at least. I think there was 1 Labour and 2 Conservatives. And I can't. Yes, and I think there were actually more Conservatives than Labour. But of those who voted against it, most of them were scientists or engineers. And they knew it was nonsense at the time, but nobody else did, because they hadn't got the scientific background, unfortunately, and didn't know they hadn't. Can't say everybody's got to have a scientific background, but you've got to know that you don't know.
But Philip, I know, back in my day in school, you used to have to, I was talking about this earlier with somebody else, we used to have to go to a library and pick out a book to learn what we wanted to know. And usually the book was probably about 20 years out of date if you were in the schools that I was in. Yes. And that's, you know what I mean, for textbooks and what have you. They were used right throughout my schooling, and some of them were still used after I'd left. So you knew that they were behind. But you went and found out. Now, we've got MPs in Parliament who, if they don't know, these days, you've only got to click a button to learn or to look at or to ask somebody what you don't know.
Yes, that's partly true. The problem remains, though, that these days clicking the button, you don't know whether what you have clicked knows or whether they are propagandists, because there's a vast amount out there, websites and so forth, that are propaganda for the climate change scam. So it is difficult, and the trouble is it can be self-feeding. In other words, you just feed yourself with what you want to hear, and that's not difficult these days. It's a difficult one. I mean, but I think the first thing is to be able to know that you don't know, and therefore, ask around and do your best to ask around in a much more wide spectrum, of talking to people who don't agree and those that do, and weigh it up. At least would help. But of course, nowadays you can't argue. You're not allowed to argue. I remember talking to. Sorry,
no, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I mean the whole business of being non-platformed and all the rest of it. I was talking, and just excuse me while I quickly remind myself of his name. I'm of that age now, I'm sorry to say, where names fall away, like, Steve Baker, MP. I don't know whether he still is, but he was. And it was an informal chat I was having, and was skeptic, and still is, I think, about the climate. And I said to him, now, one of the things I've noticed about people who are skeptics and who do speak up is that they tend to avoid talking about carbon dioxide, because as being something positive, not negative. They'll go a long way along the economics, saying this is, it's going to cost us a fortune, all that, which is fine. But I said to him, why don't you raise the issue of that carbon dioxide itself is not the problem? And he was very honest. He said, that's like standing on a landmine, which I thought, put it rather well. This is politics, of course. You have to do what you think is possible. But I have noticed this among some skeptics, that they tend in public to skirt round the fact that CO2 isn't the problem. Because if you dare say that, you've just made an alliance with the devil, I suppose.
But this is the problem, Philip, and the thing I think that these MPs should have looked at really is when you've got no debate on both sides. Now, to me, it was the same with a certain medical intervention that we've just had. Yes. If there's nobody allowed to speak, and in the old days, you used to have a government with an opposition. Yes. Now, for the last certainly 20 years, we've had no opposition.
On either side.
On either side,
as it were, yes.
And it's the same at the moment. There is no opposition to what is going on. There should be hell on earth being raised by the opposition on a number of fronts at the moment, and it's absolutely silent. I think there's a couple of Reform MPs doing their best.
Yeah, but I mean, it's difficult, very difficult.
But there is no opposition. It's like a European Parliament has come here. Instead of us training the European Parliament as to how it should be working, it's like a European Parliament coming over here with absolutely no opposition to everything that's going through. But that's always alerts me, because I always like to look at two sides of the coin.
There are always, there should be two, even the old American system, which was the red team and the blue team. That was a way in which you got, quote, civil servants and, to thrash out these issues. I don't know how successful that is now, but, it did exist. And so genuine opposition could be raised and points made. In fact, there's a very good book written by, again, this is going to go, called, oh gosh, this is terrible. He wrote, again, sorry, this is cheating again. I just got to remind myself, otherwise I'm going to go mad quietly. He wrote a book about the IPCC, and I haven't got the name here. And basically, he was a scientist, and he was a civil servant in the Obama administration. So, he wasn't right wing or anything horrific, also as it appears to be. And he read the actual papers presented to the IPCC. And that's what none of the politicians who go to these meetings ever do. And he concluded from all of them that they were basically saying, when you stripped it down, there wasn't a problem. Never had been. But of course, that's not what comes out in the reports, because they have another committee whose job it is to use the old-fashioned phrase, sex it up, to make it look as if there is one. And oh dear, this is ridiculous. I forgot his name, but never mind. And he went through it all and said, no, look, none of these things show that there is a problem, which is not what people want to hear, because of course there's money in it. If there is one.
Absolutely, and big money. The other thing is, you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said you taught out of a textbook and you realized afterwards that you were wrong, because science is never settled.
No, yes, Unsettled is the name of the book, by the way.
Oh, is it?
Thank you. But again, his name has escaped me, but it'll pop back into my mind at some point. But Unsettled, if you go Google it, I think you'll find the book, hopefully. And but anyway, but that's it. Science is not like that. Science is always provisional. And scientists and people doing it should be always skeptical. That's the point. You test things to destruction if you can, a theory or an idea. Now, it's tempting, of course, to not test things to destruction. In other words, only find the data that suits you. That's because we're human. We have a tendency to be to be proved right. But the real scientist, if you like, if he's ideal scientist, should I say, is somebody who tests his own theories to destruction, if he can. And that's how science progresses, because otherwise you get stuck with an idea, a theory, a hypothesis, which is long past its sell-by date. So
we're in a mess in that respect, because when going back to the sort of 60s, when I was in school, we were not taught to believe what we were being taught. We were taught to check what we were being taught. And that's a whole world of difference now, when there is no debate, and you're taught not how to think, you're taught what to think, which is totally different. We were taught how to think. And that people have accused me of being a critical thinker, and I say you can take the critical out of it. I just think.
Yes. No, it is quite shocking, and that is the way it's done now. Is propaganda, and our schools should not be feeding propaganda to children, or terrifying them for that matter. I mean, and they worry about mental health of children. Well, I can tell you one of the causes. It's teaching them, quote, climate change, unquote. We're all doomed. We've been doomed for years. I mean, it was always going to be in the next 10 minutes, and one way or another, none of it's happened. I mean, none of us should be here, according to Paul Ehrlich, the great prophet of the 90s. He became an FRS, a fellow of the Royal Society. He was such a good prophet. And he said that by 1980, half the species on the planet will be extinct. And by 2015, he said, all life will be extinct. Oh, are you still there? Do you realize you were supposed to be extinct 10 years ago? And I mean, it really was absurd, but people believed him. And as I said, he's now an fellow of the Royal Society. I mean, talk about elevating the false prophets.
Well, if you look at Al Gore and Kerry, the two Americans, Kerry, I think it was, that said that we would be sailing over the Arctic, because the Arctic would no longer be there, and that was supposed to have gone about 10 years ago.
Oh yes, it's been going for a long time.
I mean, these people are just ridiculous. Absolutely.
Yes, there was the government scientist, I think about the third before the one we've got now, who predicted that in 100 years' time, he said, the only habitable continent will be the Antarctic. I mean, okay, I mean, he's entitled to his opinion, I suppose, but really, it's absurd.
You have to wonder, in modern parlance, what they're on.
Well, indeed. I think it's mostly money, but I do think it's also drugs. So this is what you get paid for.
So getting back to your book,
yes.
Let's just we'll because I want to come back and talk to you again on wider subject of climate change. Can this be got through the normal book channels, or?
Well, you can get it on Amazon, but if I could urge that if you at some point put up my email address,
certainly.
That will be easier. If somebody emails me and says I'd like a copy, if they want to do that, I will send it to them with an invoice, and then they can pay my backs for the copy. It should be probably with postage. It's a tenner, £10. It's about 250 pages, paperback, I grant you, but it's got colour in it, got pictures in it, some pictures anyway.
That does help me, because and I'm sure it helps a lot of people, because pictures do mean, especially when you're talking about figures that are sort of unquantifiable in your brain.
Yes. I mean, like all things like graphs or pictures or whatever. It does help a bit. So I hope it does. People seem to have enjoyed it.
Absolutely wonderful. And I'm also going to put up, you're going to be speaking at an event very close to you in East
Yes,
Yorkshire in November.
correct.
I will
16th.
put this up as well so that people
Thank you.
can see and can come along and listen to you. And you've got another, who is your other
He's
guest?
a retired lecturer from the Manchester University in theoretical physics, so he's quite bright, brighter than me, that's for sure. But I think it'd be good value. We're sort of the title of it is Net Zero. Is it possible? Is it desirable? So I kept it sort of deliberately, slightly sort of in the air, not saying in your face stuff, because one doesn't want necessarily just to preach to the choir, as we used to say. People already agree, but but you can. I mean, I do remember, it must have been, 10 or so years ago, when I did a talk way down in Totnes, talk about going into the lion's den of eco ujar, what's it? But we set this meeting up, and quite a reasonable number of people came, and including this, I say, young man, younger than me anyway, who had he'd seen the title and wandered in, and he actually ran one of the sort of organic farms down there, which is fine, if that's what he wanted to do. So, and he came up to me, he said, all what you've been saying is, look, that the earth goes around the sun and the moon comes around the earth. You've been telling us what is obviously true, and it never dawned on him, bless him. But, he was very positive about it. And I was in touch with him subsequently, and still am, I think. So, I mean, it does happen, people can come in and they, when they hear something, hopefully reasonably presented, that they can think, going back to your point, they don't have to agree, but at least they can go away and think, saying, well, there may be more to this.
Philip, that's absolutely fantastic. We'll have you back again to talk about climate change, because there's so many aspects to it.
There are. I mean, we could go on until we're, as my poor wife knows, I can go on forever and ever.
No. And I'm delighted to talk about it. In our event in Derbyshire, we had you to Gateshead. We have to shift the balance from certain subjects each time. So we're not doing climate change this time because we did it last. We're doing common law, if you like, as a replacement, because that is now coming very much to the fore.
Indeed, it is.
And so that's the. But we'll certainly have you back. And the great Roger Arthur has been before, who writes extensively, I know, to Mr. Miliband, and he's wonderful again. And we're talking about electricity and all the things that are, the grid can't possibly cope, and etc.
It didn't cope. A few days ago, it was about to go down. There was a crisis.
But people just don't understand. We're very fortunate. My husband is absolutely brilliant. We are actually purely on solar with a backup generator, which costs us about £2.50 a day.
I think that's very sensible. I said it, I think up in Gateshead, I said, buy a generator, because you will need it, because it keeps fridges going, it keeps your boiler going. This is the thing people forget, that a gas boiler needs electricity, unfortunately, to run the pumps and the electronics.
Absolutely. For us, it's the fridges and freezers, because we grow so much stuff on the land.
Well,
At this time of year, it goes into the freezer for the winter. So that's, so we do need, but I feel for people in high-rise flats, etc., these are the people I worry about.
Yeah, because they can't run a generator, or you can't park it by the window. Well, I suppose you could, but I wouldn't recommend it. I agree.
So there we go. Philip, we'll have you back again. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Liz, for having me.
While the Earth Endures, and I think the foreword to that book was written by an old friend of mine who you probably don't know that I knew, was the late, great David Bellamy.
Bellamy, who was a lovely man.
Oh,
absolutely lovely man.
He was what I would say gorgeous. I got to know him.
Yes.
I got to know him quite well. This is back in the time of the supposed foot and mouth outbreak. And during that time, I got to know him really quite well. And he was the most delightful